Welcome to Reddit Aliens. ER doctors, what's the worst state that a person has come in? Not safe for work. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Former ER security guard here. I've seen a lot, but a few memorable ones. 15-year-old who attempted suicide by sticking his head in a spinning lawnmower blade and basically scalped himself. Another psych patient who anally fisted himself almost up to the elbow. Motorcycle accidents involving not wearing a helmet, med-flighted in and missing a whole lot of skin. And one I still think about 17 years later. A teenage girl who coded while undergoing back alley cosmetic surgery whose dead body I pulled out of a car out front of the ED. This job is great if you're an adrenaline junkie, but also can be very sad. You need to be able to effectively cope with the stress it involves, and not everyone can do that. Med student here, graduating this year, congratulations, had a guy come in who jumped in front of the subway. He was brought in with a weak pulse, but a second ambulance came in shortly after and handed me a garbage bag. I thought it was his belongings, but when I looked inside, it was the patient's right leg. Apparently, his leg was trapped under the train, and decision was made to do a below-knee amputation in the field. It was taking too long to get the train lifted. According to the train conductor, the patient looked him straight in the eye and jumped in front as the train was pulling in. We also did resuscitative thoracotomy, cracked his ribs for direct access to massage the heart, but he was too far gone, and we pronounced him shortly after. Do you think this person should have sought medical attention sooner? ER doc here. Had a nurse come grab me while I was charting. Doc, you need to see room 6 right now. For those of you who don't work in the ER, when one of the nurses tells you to go see a patient, you run. I take a few steps toward room 6 and the smell of rotting flesh hit me like a trunk. I gagged on the spot, and this is during COVID times. I am masked. I peer through the glass doors of room 6 and notice a well-appearing young female. Because she looked so well, I knew I could spend an extra minute taking a quick detour to find a handful of alcohol swabs that I promptly opened and shoved in my mask to help quench the smell. I walked into the room and find this young 30-year-old female with her leg inside a trash bag, sitting next to her parents and family. They do not seem fazed by the rancid smell. Meanwhile, I hear one of our veteran ER nurses vomiting in the background. I introduce myself to everyone and ask what brought the young lady to the ER and why her leg was in a trash bag. She starts not by talking, but by simply removing the trash bag, and there I saw it. A 6 by 8 inch necrotic, fungating tumor protruding from her tibia. She then proceeds to explain, "It started 6 months ago with a cut that wouldn't heal. It then changed to appear like a fungal skin infection." She Googled it and was confident in the diagnosis. She decided to treat it by starving it of sugar and going on a sugar-free vegan diet. Eventually, she convinced her whole family to do the same in order to help treat the infection. And then, about a month prior to her visit today, it was too large and painful to even walk around. So she's been living in her room at home, taking virtual online college courses. She added on that she's lost 30 pounds since the infection began siphoning the nutrients away from my body a few months ago. Because it grew and developed so slowly, her family and herself were completely acclimated to the smell and didn't notice anything. By this point in the conversation, I heard another nurse vomit. I then sat down and delivered the bad news, that this was not a fungal infection and likely advanced cancer, that we would be admitting her to the hospital for further workup and surgical resection. I followed up on her inpatient testing the next week, innumerable metastatic tumors to both her lungs. I never saw the biopsy results, but my guess is melanoma versus squamous cells. Poor girl is probably dead by now, if she didn't hit the lottery with immunotherapy for metastatic melanoma. All the best. Paramedic here. Grossest call? Guy fell down in Hoarder house. Wife was too embarrassed to ask for help, so she fed and cleaned him on the floor. Patient laid on a dirty tile floor for 2 weeks. His right arm was so swollen and covered in maggots, the arm was as large as a leg. Removing parts of his clothes, so much tissue was already breaking down all over his body. Black and oozing pus. Man spent his last week alive in a nightmare fever dream. I've had more graphic deaths, of course, but holy shit, what a miserable way to die. Orthopedic surgery resident spent a lot of time in the ED. The dude who was pushing his girlfriend's car off the freeway at night and got hit from behind may have been the worst I've seen recently. Was alive. Legs were annihilated. ED Night Doc here. Worst I ever saw was someone who had tried to commit suicide with a shotgun, put the gun under the chin and pulled the trigger, must have flinched at the last moment as they blew off most of their lower jaw and mid-face up to the nasal bone. They were conscious and trying to talk when they came in. Whoa. Not a doctor, a nurse. A mentally disabled man who was also blind and deaf who lived with relatives. Apparently he lived locked away in the basement and they would just bring him down bread and peanut butter and water to eat, and that's all he had eaten for over 2 years. The police were called when the neighbors saw an emaciated, bearded old man crawling around the backyard, naked and confused. Guy comes in, leg wounds full of maggots, covered in filth, lice in his hair and beard, emaciated and starving. I remember receiving him from the emergency department, trying to calm him down because he couldn't see or hear and was mentally disabled. We washed him and cut his hair and deloused him. Do you know how people always complain about the hospital food? I've never seen a patient more appreciative of getting 3 square meals ever. We would signal to him by taking his hand gently and touching it to his mouth that dinner was in front of him, and he would get a look on his face like it was the best thing that ever happened in his life. He always ate every last morsel, and we ended up ordering him double portions until he put on a good 40 pounds. He was with us for about 3 months awaiting placement. He went from 90 pounds to 130 pounds in that time. He was actually very sweet. It makes me sick that his family treated him like that. I'm not sure whatever happened to them, but I know there was an investigation. Good.
Well, I mean, he was just doing what he was told to do.
Eons ago during my residency, a guy came into the ER complaining of a venomous snake bite. He was also holding on to the very snake that bit him. The snake was still alive, and the guy was holding the snake behind its head. He said he'd always been told to bring the animal that bit you for testing. Good times in the rural South. My mom was an ER nurse, and she said the worst case she ever had to deal with involved a kid whose parents had backed over them in the driveway. Apparently, the toddler had the skin of their face completely pulled off where the tire had basically pinched it off of them. The kid survived, but my mom said she'll never forget the screams of that child. We had a patient who had some gangrene near a vein caused by needle use. She left the hospital against medical advice before receiving any treatment, came back a few weeks later, and her entire arm was necrotic to the point it looked mummified. She had lost use of it some time ago and was just so high it wasn't a concern until she started getting violently ill, had to amputate at her shoulder. Probably would have only had to do some skin grafts had she not left in the first place. Not as graphic as some others here, but I can't believe a person could walk around like that for so long like it was nothing. Don't do drugs, kids. An elderly disabled veteran had moved in with a sister and her husband, and they promptly locked him in their garage. They would occasionally throw bread and alcohol in there with him and proceeded to collect cash, his disability checks, as they arrived. He sat in that garage in a drunken stupor and his own waste for God only knows for how long, before a neighbor reported hearing crying from the garage and a god-awful smell once he got close enough. The paramedics and police arrived. The home's occupants were immediately arrested on a variety of charges and wheeled the victim away. They brought the gentleman into the ER, and the stench of rotting flesh arrived as the door opened. He was sitting up and leaning forward with a plastic shopping bag clutched in each hand. He was wearing those bags like socks and held on until we got him settled into a bed. The technician and I began to gingerly remove the bags from his feet and found all the flesh to be missing from the ankles down and the bones covered with maggots. He was a diabetic, and as he lost circulation to his extremities, they rotted, and the maggots ate away all the dead flesh, ironically keeping him alive. There were only bits of flesh remaining between the toes. Then as we began to disrobe him further, we found more maggots crawling out of his penis and anus, eating him from the inside out. We put on full hazmat suits and wheeled him to the reverse ventilation shower to bathe him and make him more comfortable. I remember finishing his shower and carrying him like a child back to the waiting bed. We then wrapped him in heated blankets. That was when he said the only thing I heard him say the whole time, just a simple thank you. It was clearly the nicest thing that anyone had done for him in a long time, and it was the most meaningful thank you I've ever received. That poor gentleman did not make it through surgery, amputations, etc., and his body just gave out from the shock of it all. This is one of the most horrible things I've ever seen, and the level of human depravity that inflicted this on this man is still something that angers me. Incidentally, both his sister and her husband were convicted of numerous charges and both received life sentences. There's little solace in that, but it doesn't dull the sorrow I feel for that man. ER Doc here. 26-year-old girl, unrestrained passenger riding with a drunk driver. Her head went into the windshield and popped the whole windshield off the car. Her skull was filleted open from the forehead up, brain completely exposed and falling out of her skull, largely intact but horribly swollen. Rest of her face and body was essentially unmarked. She was breathing on her own but not moving purposefully. She got intubated, taken to the operating room. I asked the neurosurgeon what the plan was, and he said, "I'm just gonna cut off the part that's sticking out." She had a partial lobotomy. Skull was left open with the hope the swelling would go down. She was basically brain dead that night and died a week later. Driver was drunk, but had a seatbelt on. Walked out of the ER that night.
True or false? This story had me choked up at the end. It's true.
My husband used to work in the ER, and one of the saddest stories he's ever told me was about a little girl and her mom getting hit by a drunk driver on their way to Disneyland. The little girl was unharmed and still wearing her Minnie Mouse headband, but her mom didn't make it. We both couldn't stop crying, and I still think about it from time to time. I code medical records for a living, and I've had some crazy charts. I've learned several things over the years. 1. Too many people are too embarrassed to purchase sex toys. One of the worst cases was a gentleman who rented a motel room and decided to clean it naked, like you do obviously, and was scrubbing the shower and slipped and fell on the wooden stick of a toilet plunger that just happened to be stuck to the floor of the tub when the shower rod he was holding onto for stability broke. I think he lived, but he had to have major bowel resection and was going to likely have a colostomy bag for the rest of his life. 2. People with long hair should not be around machinery unless they really secure their hair up and away. Gentleman came in from a work accident at a paper mill where he got scalped with his hair got caught in a machine and ripped his hair, scalp, and all of his head. Again, he amazingly lived, but they had to reattach his scalp. 3. Untreated diabetes is one of the worst chronic health conditions. Guy came into the ER with shortness of breath and some chest pain. Doctor realized he is in congestive heart failure. They admit him and have him get in a hospital gown and so on. He took off his shoes and the smell was absolutely horrific. They looked down at his feet and it looked like they were melting and he didn't even feel it. He had severe gangrene due to diabetic ulcers. The diabetic neuropathy was so bad he couldn't even feel it. How he couldn't smell or see these was an issue is beyond me. He ended up with bilateral below-the-knee amputations. Edit to fix grammar, originally done on phone. Trauma ICU nurse here. Large burly man with oversized telephone pole sidewise through abdomen. The pole was cut off by firefighters on each side. Everything below the pole was dead. Tons of people with their face shot off from suicide attempts. Permanently blind, unable to talk or eat, but they won't get another chance because they will live in a nursing home for the rest of their lives. Also, see tons of older people only technically alive. They are temporarily kept alive by massive amounts of drugs to keep the heart beating when they have an overwhelming infection, but that doesn't keep the organs, limbs, or sometimes brain alive. We call this futile care. It just prolongs the suffering, but some families want everything, even if it doesn't change the outcome. Not a doctor, but I used to work for the county coroner, nights and weekends. Got a call one night, real late like 2 a.m. It was cold and foggy as hell. Call was to the country, middle of nowhere. I live in a big, agey area, tons of farms and dairies and orchards. Get to the site to see emergency services everywhere. Sheriffs, fire engines, paramedics, and a giant crane. Apparently, a guy who worked the farm decided to get drunk and go till a field in the middle of the night. Wound up flipping his tractor into an irrigation ditch and it smashed down on top of him. When the crane lifted the tractor clear and the flood lit up the ditch, I couldn't even tell what I was looking at, just human meat.